Have you ever wondered how a man who has lost everything finds the strength to begin again? How a broken veteran living inside a failing truck could rise to rebuild not only a home, but an entire family? And what if the miracle guiding him was not a voice or a sign, but the gentle loyalty of a dog who never left his side? Today, you will witness the quiet courage of Daniel and his faithful companion Buddy as they turn a ruined motorhome into a place of hope, healing, and second chances. I wish you a peaceful time as you enjoy this story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning light spread across the small coastal town in a pale, muted glow, and the cool air carried the scent of salt and distant rain. Low clouds drifted slowly above the quiet harbor, where boats rocked gently against the worn wooden docks. The breeze was cold enough to raise goosebumps, but not strong enough to scatter the early stillness that hovered over the waterfront. Daniel sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck and rested his forehead against the back of his hand. He was 42 years old, but looked older. His face was carved by long days under harsh sun during deployments overseas, and long nights filled with thoughts he could not escape. His brown hair was beginning to thin at the temples, and streaks of gray had formed across his beard. He had the broad shoulders of a man who once trained his body every day, but hardship had worn them down and left a subtle slump that revealed both fatigue and resignation. His deep-set eyes showed a mixture of caution and quiet softness, shaped by loss and shaped by memories he rarely spoke about. Daniel had once been steady and confident, but returning home from war and losing his job had turned him into a man who measured each day with a kind of hesitant endurance. Buddy lay curled in the passenger seat beside him. The dog had a thick coat of golden fur, darkened around the ears and back, and his chest rose and fell with slow, comforting breaths. Buddy was 5 years old, strong but gentle, with eyes that held a strange understanding of the world around him. Daniel had adopted him shortly after leaving the service, when his nights were restless and his days felt hollow and cold. Buddy had helped him through the worst of those moments by staying close, pressing his warm body against Daniel whenever he sensed the tremors of anxiety or the heaviness of silence. Buddy was a reminder that even when everything else had crumbled, Daniel was never entirely alone. The truck smelled faintly of old leather and engine oil, and the worn seat springs creaked when Daniel shifted. He lived in this truck because he had no other place to go. After his final job at a construction yard ended, he tried to keep up with rent, but his savings disappeared quickly. He sold what he could and moved into the truck, hoping it would only be temporary. Weeks turned into months, and the worn cabin of the pickup became both his shelter and the cage of his loneliness. Daniel spent his mornings doing manual work at the harbor when it was available. He lifted crates, sorted ropes, and helped fishermen haul supplies. The labor was rough on his body, but Joe, the harbor manager, offered it whenever he could. Joe was in his late 60s, with white hair flattened by a constant sea breeze, and a wide frame shaped by years of hauling nets and climbing boats. He was not warm or talkative, but he recognized effort when he saw it, and he appreciated Daniel, even if he showed it only through short nods and silent gestures. People said Joe was strict, but fair, and Daniel knew the old man understood quiet struggle better than he let on. Each evening, Daniel parked his truck near the far edge of the docks, where the sound of water lapping against the pylons eased his nerves. The sky would fade into a blue-gray curtain, and Daniel would sit in the dim interior while Buddy leaned against him for warmth. The nights were the hardest. Cold air seeped into the metal frame of the truck and rattled the windows. Daniel wrapped himself in an old blanket, though it never held warmth for long. Buddy pressed his side against Daniel, as if trying to anchor him. On many nights, Daniel woke with his heart pounding and his breath tight, recalling distant explosions and the echo of shouted orders. Buddy would lift his head gently, place a paw on Daniel's arm, and stay still until Daniel regained his breath. It was a rhythm. They had fallen into a silent method of survival. Daniel tried to keep his thoughts focused on simple tasks: wake up help at the harbor, find food for himself, and Buddy take small steps through the day. But private thoughts often returned to the moments when he still had a home and a steady life. He once imagined a long future with a stable family and steady work. Now, he lived inside a truck, surrounded by uncertainty and fatigue. Sometimes, he tried to convince himself that he had accepted this reality, but in truth, he fought a quiet war inside his mind each night. He avoided talking about his past because the memories were heavy and layered with things he wished he had never seen and things he wished had never happened. Buddy shifted and sat up, stretching his legs before nudging Daniel's elbow. Daniel managed a tired smile, one of the rare signs of warmth that appeared on his face these days. He petted Buddy between the ears, letting his fingers feel the soft fur that had brought him comfort for years. The dog looked at him with calm patience, as if telling him that morning routines still mattered and that they should step outside soon. Daniel reached for his jacket, a faded green coat frayed at the cuffs with worn fabric that told its own stories. He put it on slowly, feeling the stiff ache in his shoulders and knees. When he stepped out of the truck, the cold air hit him fully. He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the chill. Buddy hopped down beside him, his paws landing softly on the gravel. Clouds continued to drift overhead, and the gulls called out in sharp cries across the empty docks. Daniel walked toward the supply shed, where Joe usually posted the day's tasks. The wooden boards of the dock felt damp beneath his boots, and the smell of brine and algae filled the air. Joe was already there, checking a list nailed to the wall. His posture was rigid, and his square jaw was set in its usual thoughtful silence. Joe had rough hands, with deep creases that showed a life spent working the sea. When he saw Daniel approach, he gave a slow, acknowledging nod. Daniel nodded back, not expecting more. He preferred it this way: quiet, simple, straightforward. Too much talking made him uneasy, and too many questions made him nervous. Joe pointed at a stack of crates near a moored boat. Daniel followed the gesture and set to work. The crates were heavy, and the wood scraped against his palms. Buddy sat nearby, watching him with focused eyes. Every now and then, the dog would stand, sniff the air, and circle back, as if ensuring nothing threatened Daniel. The work was repetitive, but it grounded him, offering a steady tempo that his mind could cling to. As the morning passed, Daniel felt the familiar fatigue spread through his muscles. His breaths grew heavier, and his shirt clung to his skin. Yet he kept going, because he needed the small wage, and because it kept his thoughts from drifting into darker places. The sun moved behind clouds, and a soft drizzle began to fall, coating his hair and jacket in a thin layer of moisture. Buddy shook the water off, but stayed close, letting Daniel know he was there. When the work ended for the day, Daniel returned to the truck, with Buddy trotting beside him. He opened a small can of food and shared part of it with the dog. Even though the portion was small, Buddy ate with gentle gratitude, then lay his head on Daniel's knee. Daniel took a slow breath and rested his hand on Buddy's neck. Though the future was unclear, though the truck felt smaller and smaller each week, though memories still stung, Daniel found strength in the steady presence of the dog at his side. Buddy was the warmth that softened the cold nights and the company that eased the weight of quiet sorrow. Daniel leaned back against the seat and watched the sky dim. He did not know what tomorrow would hold, but he knew that Buddy would face it with him. And for now, that was enough to keep him moving forward in the fragile rhythm of his wandering life. A thin layer of fog swept across the harbor that morning, and the air carried the chill of the ocean. The light was soft and pale, drifting through the mist and settling on the wooden docks in a quiet calm. The boats barely moved, and the tide whispered gently against the shore. It was the kind of weather that felt suspended, as if the day had not fully decided how it wanted to begin. Daniel stood near the back of his old pickup truck, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The cold had crept into his joints overnight, and his body ached in the familiar way it always did after too many restless hours of sleep in the cramped cabin. Buddy stood beside him, sniffing the cool air. The dog's golden and dark coat gleamed faintly in the muted light, and his steady posture made Daniel feel slightly more grounded. Buddy was always alert, always ready to follow Daniel's lead, and that loyalty steadied Daniel more than he ever admitted aloud. Daniel had come to expect little from each day. He would wake, begin the slow process of peeling the stiffness from his muscles, and wander toward the dock where work might or might not be available. But this morning, Joe had asked to speak with him. Joe rarely asked for anything more than a nod, so the request had left Daniel quietly uneasy. He wondered if there was a problem, if the harbor no longer needed him, or if someone had complained about him parking his truck overnight. Worry always came easily now, as if his mind was trained to expect bad news. Joe approached from the far walkway, his gait steady and firm. He was a man shaped by decades of labor at the harbor, a wide-framed figure with thick arms and a strong chest. His white hair was cut short and usually messy from the sea wind. Deep lines carved across his brow and around his eyes gave him a stern look. But beneath that was a steadiness that suggested he had seen far worse storms than the ones that drifted across the sky. Joe was a man who valued effort more than words, which was one of the reasons Daniel respected him. Morning Joe said, in his usual low voice that carried the roughness of age and years spent talking over engines and waves. Daniel nodded and replied quietly, "Morning. Joe, is everything all right?" His voice was cautious and unsure. Joe looked at him for a moment, his sharp eyes seeming to weigh Daniel's questions and the worry behind them. Then Joe lifted one hand in a gesture that told Daniel to follow. "Come with me," Joe said. "I want to show you something." Daniel hesitated, but followed with Buddy padding close behind. They walked along the edge of the docks, past stacks of old ropes and crates faded from long days under the sun. Daniel tried to read Joe's body language, but the older man revealed nothing. Daniel felt the tightness in his stomach grow, the familiar sense of bracing for disappointment. He glanced at Buddy, who walked with calm confidence, and Daniel tried to borrow a bit of that ease. Joe led them past the last of the working boats and toward a far corner of the harbor, where unused equipment lay covered in tarps and rust-stained barrels sat forgotten. The fog was thicker here, dampening the sounds of the harbor and muting the world. As they rounded a final row of crates, Daniel saw it. A motorhome sat near the fence, a long, forgotten relic of better days. Its white paint had peeled to expose dull metal beneath, and patches of moss clung to its edges. The roof sagged slightly on one side, as if it had been punched by the weight of too many storms. A window on the right was cracked from corner to corner, and the front tires were nearly flat. The entire vehicle looked tired, abandoned, and hopeless. For a moment, Daniel wondered why Joe had brought him here, and his uncertainty deepened. Joe stopped in front of the motorhome and crossed his arms. He looked at the old vehicle with a long, steady breath, as if replaying its own history in his mind. Then he turned to Daniel. "You cannot keep sleeping in that truck," Joe said. His tone was blunt, but not unkind. "You will ruin your back more than you already have, and winter is coming fast. This thing has been sitting here too long. The owner never came back for it. I manage this place now, and I am deciding its future." Daniel blinked, unsure what Joe was suggesting. He looked again at the motorhome, at its sagging roof and cracked windows. It looked barely habitable, but the idea that it could be something more than an abandoned shell stirred a small, cautious spark in him. Before Daniel could speak, Joe continued, "You can have it for $1. His voice was firm. $1, and you take the night shift at the harbor. Keep an eye on things. Make sure kids do not wander in. You fix it up, and it is yours." The words took time to settle in Daniel's mind. $1. It sounded absurd at first, like a joke, but Joe was not a man who joked. Daniel looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of labor. He felt the weight of exhaustion in his bones, the loneliness of long nights in the pickup, and the growing fear of what would happen if he continued to drift through life without something stable beneath him. Buddy nudged his leg, sensing the shift in his emotions. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. He swallowed and looked at Joe. "Why me?" His voice trembled slightly. Joe answered without hesitation, "Because you work hard. Because you do not complain. Because I have seen men who give up, and you are not one of them." Joe's eyes softened just a little as he added, "There is something solid in you, even if you have forgotten it." The unexpected kindness hit Daniel deeper than he liked to admit. For a moment he struggled to speak. He had been drifting for so long, surviving instead of living. The thought of having a place to sleep that was not cramped and cold filled him with a cautious kind of hope. He knew the motorhome was a wreck and would demand more work than he felt ready to give, but it was still a chance, a beginning, a place for him and Buddy to breathe. Daniel nodded slowly. "I will take it," he said, his voice steadying. $1. Joe gave the faintest hint of a smile, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old key ring with a single worn key. He placed it in Daniel's hand without ceremony. "Night shift starts tonight," Joe said. "For now, take a look inside. See what you are getting into." Daniel approached the motorhome with Buddy following closely. He unlocked the stiff door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned loudly, and a stale smell drifted out. Inside, the interior was dim and cluttered. The ceiling had water stains forming brown patches across sagging fabric. The floor creaked under his boots, and several boards felt soft from rot. Wires hung loose near the kitchenette, and a cabinet dangled crookedly on one hinge. Dust coated every surface in a dull gray film. Daniel stepped inside and let the silence fill him. It was a mess, a disaster in many ways. But it was also shelter. It was a roof and four walls, a place he could eventually call home. Buddy hopped in after him, sniffing the corners and examining the narrow hallway. The dog turned back to look at Daniel with a soft whine, as if asking if this strange broken space was where they would stay. Daniel knelt down and placed a hand on Buddy's chest. His voice was quiet but certain. "This is our chance, Buddy. We can make it work. It will not be easy, but it is better than the truck. It is something." For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the faint pulse of determination, a tiny ember of resolve that might one day turn into something steady. He took a slow breath and let the moment settle into his bones. This old motorhome would not save him, but it could give him a place to begin rebuilding the parts of himself he had lost. And that was enough for now. Night settled over the harbor with a heavy quiet, and the air carried a damp chill that clung to Daniel's skin the moment he stepped inside the motorhome. The sky outside was a deep shade of blue-gray, and thin streaks of mist drifted across the water, giving the entire dock an eerie stillness. The temperature had dropped quickly after sunset, leaving the old metal frame of the motorhome cold enough to make Daniel shiver. It was a harsh reminder that this place, rough and unfinished, had a long way to go before it could ever feel like a home. The inside of the motorhome felt colder than the air outside. The thin walls trapped moisture, and the ceiling sagged slightly in the middle where years of rain had weakened the roof. Daniel could see the faint outline of brown water stains spreading across the ceiling paneling in uneven circles. Every time the wind pushed against the harbor, the old vehicle groaned quietly, as if waking from a restless sleep. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of rusted pipes and damp wood. Buddy followed Daniel in, his paws making soft sounds on the uneven floor. The dog shook his body once, sending tiny droplets of moisture scattering off his thick, golden and dark coat. He then curled himself beside Daniel as he always did, finding a small patch of floor that was only slightly less damp than the rest. Buddy lowered his head gently onto his front paws, but his eyes stayed open, following every movement Daniel made. Daniel looked around the small space with a heavy heart. The corners were dark, the floorboards felt soft and fragile in places, and the narrow windows were covered in a thin layer of condensation. Every breath he exhaled formed a faint cloud in front of him. He reached for one of the old plastic containers he had managed to save from the truck and placed it beneath a steady drip coming from the ceiling. The droplets hit the bottom of the container with a hollow rhythmic sound that echoed through the cramped space. He placed another container near the back wall, where a second leak had started forming. The simple act of arranging containers for rainwater made him feel as though he was fighting a losing battle against a home that wanted to collapse around him. He knew the motorhome needed repairs far beyond what he could afford right now. The roof, the wiring, the mold in the corners, the softening floor, everything seemed to be failing at once, yet it was still better than sleeping in the truck. Or at least, that was what he tried to tell himself. Daniel sat down on the edge of the narrow, built-in bench. The seat cushion was old and frayed, and when he shifted his weight, he could feel the stiff springs beneath the thin fabric. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, trying to focus on the faint hum of the harbor outside. He could hear distant waves, the clinking of metal chains tapping lightly as boats rocked, and the low whisper of wind weaving through the docks. These sounds usually grounded him, but tonight they only deepened the sense of isolation pressing on his mind. Buddy lifted his head and nudged Daniel's hand. His warm breath brushed against Daniel's fingers, and his dark brown eyes held a calm, loyal softness. Daniel let his palm rest on the top of Buddy's head, and the dog leaned into the touch, pressing close with natural instinct. Buddy was 5 years old now, strong and healthy despite the conditions. His steady breathing and warm body reminded Daniel of the quiet comfort he had needed so many times after coming home from overseas. Daniel took a slow breath and stared at the dripping ceiling. Memories he never invited crept in at the edges of his consciousness. Nights spent in tents, surrounded by the distant thud of mortar fire. Faces of soldiers he once served with flickering in and out of focus like ghosts. The endless desert heat. The smell of burning sand. The way silence after battle felt heavier than the noise. He could never fully escape those memories. They clung to him like shadows. He closed his eyes, hoping the darkness behind his eyelids would offer relief. But instead, the memories sharpened. He saw the dusty ground beneath him, felt the rush of adrenaline as he pulled a wounded friend to cover, heard the crack of gunfire, and tasted the bitterness of fear. His chest tightened as his mind dragged him back to places he had tried so hard to leave behind. His breathing grew shallow, and his hands began to tremble. The weight of those moments felt unbearable, pressing down on him until the air inside the motorhome felt scarce. Buddy moved closer. The dog placed his head gently on Daniel's knee, a silent gesture that cut through the darkness, taking hold of him. Daniel opened his eyes to the sight of Buddy's steady gaze, warm and patient. The trembling in Daniel's hands eased slightly. He placed both palms on Buddy's back, feeling the solid strength of the dog's muscles beneath the thick fur. It was grounding. It pulled him away from the memories and back into the dimly lit motorhome. Daniel whispered a shaky breath. "I am trying, Buddy." His voice was rough and low. "I am trying to hold everything together." Buddy nudged him again, a simple movement filled with reassurance. The dog did not understand the words, but he understood the emotion. He understood the weight Daniel carried and met it with the one thing he could offer comfort. Hours passed slowly. Rain continued tapping against the roof in a steady, relentless rhythm, interrupted only by the occasional dripping sound hitting the plastic containers. The air inside remained cold, and Daniel wrapped himself in an old blanket he kept folded near the front. Buddy curled tightly against his side, sharing warmth in the only way he knew how. Every now and then, Buddy shifted slightly, adjusting his position so he could stay in contact with Daniel. His presence prevented Daniel from falling too deep into the heavy thoughts pulling at him. Daniel knew he had bills waiting. He knew his part-time work at the harbor barely covered food for him and Buddy. He knew the motorhome needed repairs he could not afford. Each of these worries sat on his shoulders with a pressure that grew heavier with every passing day. Sometimes he feared waking up in the middle of the night and finding everything collapsed around him, the leaks worse, the floor sagging more, the cold cutting deeper. Sometimes he feared waking up alone in a world that kept pushing him down. But tonight was not one of those nights. Tonight, Buddy was there. The dog breathed softly, the warm exhale brushing against Daniel's arm. That warmth reached deeper than his skin. It kept Daniel from sinking too far. It reminded him that he was not entirely lost. It reminded him that someone depended on him, someone trusted him, someone believed in him without question. Daniel lay back slowly on the bench, pulling the blanket over himself and Buddy. He closed his eyes again, not to escape, but to rest. The rain continued its quiet pattern, falling steadily through the night. The leaks dripped into the containers with soft taps that echoed in the cramped air. The floor remained damp, the darkness remained thick, and the cold remained sharp. But within that harshness, Buddy stayed beside him, a constant anchor in a life filled with uncertainty. And even though Daniel felt the weight of exhaustion pulling him down, a small flicker of determination stayed alive inside him. He did not know how he would fix the motorhome or how he would face the debts. He did not know how long he could keep going. But he knew Buddy would be there through every dark hour, steadying him, warming him, keeping him from collapsing under everything he carried. Tonight, the motorhome was broken. The roof leaked. The air was cold. The future felt heavy. But Buddy was at Daniel's side. And that small truth kept Daniel moving forward, one quiet breath at a time. The afternoon light fell softly through a blanket of thin clouds, and the air carried a faint smell of salt, mixed with cold moisture drifting from the harbor. A gentle breeze moved through the open door of the motorhome and stirred the dust resting on the old wooden floor. It was neither warm nor cold. A quiet stillness settled over the docks, as if time had chosen to slow down for a moment. Inside the motorhome, Daniel stood near the narrow counter, holding a damp cloth in one hand. His shoulders felt heavy after another long morning of working at the harbor, but he had decided that today he would at least try to clean a small part of the motorhome. The place had become increasingly difficult to live in, and the mess inside made him feel as though his life was sinking deeper into chaos. Even though he lacked the energy, he pushed himself forward with the quiet determination that had carried him through so many difficult days. Buddy watched Daniel closely from the middle of the room. The dog stood with ears alert and tail still, his golden and dark fur catching little flecks of light from the window. Buddy was always patient, but today he seemed unusually focused. He paced slowly across the room, stopping near the worn rug that sat between the small bench and the kitchenette. He sniffed the edges of the rug, then pressed one paw against it lightly. Daniel noticed Buddy, but continued wiping down the counter, thinking the dog was simply curious or trying to find a warm spot on the floor. As Daniel moved around the small space, his mind drifted into its usual patterns. He thought of the bills. He could not pay the roof. He could not fix the job that barely provided enough for food. He thought of the weight of each night when memories he did not want flooded his mind. Cleaning was supposed to distract him, but his thoughts kept circling. He wanted to find some small sense of control, but the crumbling motorhome around him made it difficult. Everything felt unstable and fragile, like one wrong move could make the whole place fall apart. Buddy let out a soft sound, not quite a bark, but not silence either. Daniel looked down and saw the dog pawing at the rug again, this time more insistent. Buddy pressed his paw firmly and tugged slightly at the corner. Daniel frowned and lowered the cloth, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. He walked over to Buddy and knelt down the floor, groaning beneath his weight. "What is it, Buddy?" he asked in a low, tired voice. The dog looked at him with bright, determined eyes, then tapped the same spot again, as if urging Daniel to pay attention. Daniel reached forward and lifted the corner of the rug, expecting to find nothing more than dust or another soft patch of floorboard that needed fixing. But something was different. The wooden plank beneath the rug shifted slightly when he touched it. He pressed again and felt it move under his palm. The board was loose, not rotten, not broken. Loose. his brows knit together with cautious curiosity. Buddy stepped back, giving Daniel room while keeping his eyes locked on the spot. Daniel slid his fingers along the edge of the plank and found a gap wide enough to lift. He hesitated for a moment. The motorhome was full of surprises, most of them unpleasant, and he was unsure if he had the strength for another problem today. But something in the steady, calm presence of Buddy made him breathe out slowly and pull. The plank lifted with a soft scraping sound, revealing a narrow, hidden compartment beneath the floor. Daniel blinked in surprise, his tired eyes struggling to process what he was seeing. Inside the compartment were several old envelopes, a rolled sheet of paper bound with a thin strip of cloth, and a small stack of folded documents that had yellowed slightly with age. The air rising from the compartment smelled faintly of dry paper and wood, a contrast to the damp mildew that filled the rest of the motorhome. Daniel carefully lifted the stack of documents. The paper felt dry and delicate beneath his rough fingertips. He set them down on the bench, then unrolled the cloth-bound sheet. It was a blueprint, drawn by hand showing the layout of the motorhome with detailed notes about structural reinforcements, wiring replacement, and potential upgrades. Someone had once planned to repair this motorhome thoroughly. Someone had cared enough to design improvements that never came to life. Daniel swallowed slowly. His mind raced with questions, but he kept them quiet, letting the moment speak for itself. He picked up the next envelope and opened it gently. Inside, he found old ownership papers listing previous owners and the legal transfer documents for the vehicle. Some pages were stamped, some signed. All of them looked official and surprisingly well preserved. At the bottom of the stack were several pages related to veteran housing support programs and guidelines for applying for assistance. They were not filled out, but they were clear and organized. Daniel stared at them, unable to speak. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to hope. These papers were not random scraps. They were exactly what he had needed for so long. Documents that could help him prove ownership. Documents that could help him apply for support he had previously failed to access. Documents that could help him build a future he thought was out of reach. Buddy stepped forward and nudged Daniel's arm. The dog's warm presence grounded him, pulling him away from the overwhelming flood of thoughts. Daniel placed a hand on Buddy's head, his voice quiet and strained with emotion. "You found this, Buddy." Daniel's throat tightened. "You really found this." He let out a slow breath. "You have no idea what this means." He sank onto the bench, clutching the papers in his hands. For weeks, he had felt trapped by darkness and dead ends. Everything had felt like a wall he could not climb. But now, without warning, the simplest gesture from Buddy had opened a doorway, a chance, a path forward he had not dared to imagine. Buddy rested his head on Daniel's knee, his warm weight anchoring Daniel in the moment. Daniel stroked Buddy's fur, feeling the reality of it. He felt the warmth, the loyalty, the quiet, unspoken understanding that Buddy had always given him. It was as if the dog knew how to guide him, even when Daniel had no idea where he was going. Daniel's breath steadied. He looked around the broken interior of the motorhome, and for the first time in many days, it did not feel like a collapsing prison. It felt like something that could one day become whole again. Something worth fighting for. Not just because he needed a place to live, but because Buddy had given him a reason to believe that small miracles could still exist. He gathered the papers, carefully setting them in a neat pile. He would read each one later when the light was better. For now, he just held on to the feeling rising slowly in his chest, the feeling he had lost long ago. A faint, steady spark of possibility. Tonight the motorhome was still cold. The floor was still damp. The ceiling still leaked. But something had changed. Something small, but powerful. Buddy had found a secret beneath the floor, and inside that secret was a fragile thread of hope stretching forward through the darkness. Daniel looked at Buddy and whispered in a soft voice filled with gratitude, "You saved me again, Buddy. You really did." And Buddy pressed closer, sealing the moment quietly in the dim light of the motorhome. A gray afternoon sky stretched low over the harbor, and the air felt cool with a light breeze drifting across the water. The clouds hung heavy, but the rain had not yet started, and a faint metallic smell from the docks filled the quiet space. The motorhome sat in its usual place near the far end of the harbor, looking worn and tired against the gloomy sky. Daniel was inside sorting through the small pile of papers Buddy had helped him uncover days before. His hands moved slowly, and his thoughts were tangled. Hope had flickered inside him for the first time in a long while, but that hope also brought fear. He was afraid to believe too strongly, afraid the world might collapse around him, as it had many times before. Buddy lay close by his head, resting on his paws, watching Daniel with calm, dark eyes. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the stillness outside. Buddy lifted his head and let out a quiet, alert puff of breath. Not a bark, but a sign that someone unfamiliar was near. Daniel stiffened. He rarely had visitors. Most people at the harbor kept to themselves, and he had not told anyone about the hidden documents or the small spark of possibility growing inside him. His stomach tightened as he stood and stepped toward the door. When he opened it, his breath stalled in his throat. Standing a few feet away were two people he never expected to see at the harbor. His ex-wife, Emily, stood with her arms crossed against her chest. She was in her early 40s, with medium brown hair pulled back in a loose tie. Her face was narrow and pale, and her eyes carried a mixture of worry and frustration. Lines of fatigue marked her features, suggesting sleepless nights or heavy thoughts she could not shake. Emily had always been practical, firm, and careful with emotions, and she had carried the burden of holding the family together long after Daniel had returned from service, changed and struggling. Beside her stood their son Michael, who was 17, now tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead. His eyes were sharp but uncertain, and his jaw was set in a way that showed both stubbornness and hurt. He had grown quickly in recent years, and Daniel realized with a painful jolt that he had missed much of that growth. Michael looked older, stronger, but he also looked guarded, as if he did not know whether to be angry or sad. Daniel stared at them, unable to hide the shock spreading across his face. Emily spoke first, her tone tight and controlled. "We heard you were living here," she said. "In this thing." Her eyes shifted toward the motorhome, taking in the peeling paint and sagging roof. Daniel could see the disappointment form instantly in her expression. Michael looked at the motorhome too, his brows lifting with disbelief. "Dad, are you serious?" he said quietly. "You are living in this." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had imagined 1,000 ways to face his past, but none of them had prepared him for this moment. He tried to steady his voice. "It is what I have for now. I am fixing it up. It is temporary." Emily shook her head slowly. You said that before, Daniel. You said temporary before. And then everything fell apart again and again. Her voice softened, but carried a fragile edge. We were worried. We heard things. People from the harbor talk. They said you were living like this, and that you were chasing something uncertain again. Daniel felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. The old wounds reopened with painful accuracy. Memories of failed promises and broken attempts flooded back. He wanted to explain that things were different this time, that he had documents that might help, that Buddy had led him to something important. But the fear of sounding desperate froze him. Michael stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. Dad, we do not want to see you hurt again. You always get caught in things that never work out. You always think you can handle it alone. Daniel stared at his son, feeling both shame and sorrow. He saw the disappointment in Michael's eyes and knew it came from a place of hurt. He wanted to reach out, but his hands felt like stone. The tension in the air grew heavy. The wind rattled the loose metal panel on the motorhome, and the sound made Daniel flinch. He took a step back and lowered his gaze. I am trying, he whispered. I am trying the best I can. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Buddy stepped forward quietly, placing himself between Daniel and the two of them. The movement was calm, not aggressive. Buddy's posture was steady, his tail still, his ears lifted with gentle alertness. He looked at Emily, then at Michael, with warm but protective eyes. Buddy did not bark. He simply stood there solid and patient, his presence speaking for Daniel when Daniel could not find the strength to defend himself. The dog's gaze held no anger, only concern, as if he wanted them to understand the weight Daniel carried every day. Michael's expression softened first. He looked at Buddy, then at his father, and something shifted in his eyes. The anger faded, replaced by a quiet sadness. Dad, he said slowly, he is protecting you. Emily's breath caught slightly as she looked at Buddy and then at Daniel. For a moment her sternness cracked, and a flicker of understanding crossed her face. She had known Daniel when he was strong and steady before war, before loss, before the world had worn him thin. Seeing Buddy stand guard over him reminded her that Daniel was not the reckless man she feared. He was a tired man fighting battles she could not see. Emily stepped closer, her voice gentler. Daniel, what is really going on? Tell us the truth. Not excuses, not promises. The truth. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He glanced down at Buddy, who pressed lightly against his leg, grounding him. He took a slow breath, gathering the courage he thought he had lost. I am struggling, he admitted. But I am trying to fix things. This motorhome, it is all I have right now, and I am doing everything I can to make it work. I do not want to fail again. Michael lowered his gaze, as if absorbing his father's words. Emily's shoulders relaxed, and she nodded slowly. We just want you safe, Daniel, and we want to understand. Daniel exhaled a long, unsteady breath as the weight on his chest eased slightly. For the first time in a long while they were listening, and he felt something shift inside him. It was not forgiveness yet, and it was not healing. But it was the beginning of a conversation he had feared for years. Buddy stayed beside him, steady, loyal, watching all three of them, with soft eyes, holding the fragile moment together. The morning air was cool and crisp, with a pale sunlight filtering through thin clouds above the harbor. A light breeze rolled across the water, carrying the scent of salt and old wood from the pier. The motorhome sat quietly beneath the gray sky, looking worn but standing steady, like it had finally learned to endure the weather around it. Inside, Daniel sat at the small, built-in table, surrounded by papers, forms, envelopes, and handwritten notes. The paperwork for veteran assistance lay spread open before him, and the sight of it made his head ache. His hands felt heavy as he held a pen and tried to focus on the words printed across each page. He had never cared much for official paperwork, even before the war. But now, every form felt like another wall he had to climb. Buddy lay at his feet, watching him closely. The dog's dark amber eyes studied Daniel with a calm understanding, as though he could sense every shift in Daniel's breathing, every small tremor of frustration that passed through him. Buddy was older now, his golden and black fur thick and warm, but he still held the steady posture of a dog who knew how to support someone without making a sound. Daniel rubbed his forehead and let out a long breath. He had already spent hours filling out documents describing his service, his medical history, and the difficulties he faced since returning home. The questions on the forms reached into places Daniel rarely touched. They brought back memories he tried to keep buried. He answered each one slowly, but the weight sat heavily on him. At one point, his frustration built so sharply that he pushed the papers away and rested his elbows on the table. His head lowered, and his voice whispered in defeat. "I cannot do this. It is too much." There were still dozens of pages left, and he felt as though each one was trying to drag him backward into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. Buddy moved instantly. The dog stood, pressed his warm head gently against Daniel's hand, and held still. That simple weight grounded Daniel more effectively than any word could. Buddy nudged again, urging him to feel something other than frustration. Daniel looked down at him, and a weary smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. "You always know," he murmured quietly. Buddy stepped back, turned toward the door, and looked over his shoulder. His tail gave one small wave. Daniel understood. He pushed away from the table and followed Buddy outside. They walked out to the narrow wooden deck near the motorhome where the wind was soft and cool. The sky above was wide and open, and the sounds of distant waves broke gently against the docks. Daniel leaned against the railing, breathing in the cold, steady air. Buddy sat beside him perfectly still, watching the horizon with the same quiet patience he had shown Daniel for years. After a few minutes, the tightness in Daniel's chest slowly eased. He thought of all the nights Buddy had helped him endure, the heavy memories he could not shake. The dog had always known how to pull him back into the present. Now he was doing it again, guiding Daniel away from the edge of discouragement so he could continue. When they returned to the motorhome, Daniel sat down again at the table. The papers still felt overwhelming, but he no longer felt trapped by them. Buddy curled up beside him, resting against Daniel's leg, a silent anchor. Daniel picked up the pen and continued filling out the forms. His handwriting was uneven, and sometimes he had to stop to gather his thoughts, but he kept going because Buddy stayed beside him, as if reminding him of the reason he could not give up. The days that followed were filled with waiting. Daniel mailed the packet of forms, and then every morning felt a knot of anxiety as he checked the post office box near the harbor. Sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes there were letters asking for additional information or clarifications. Each time Daniel felt a flicker of frustration rise inside him, but Buddy would nudge his hand or press against his side, grounding him again. There were moments when Daniel genuinely thought of abandoning the process altogether. The waiting felt endless, and the fear of rejection crept into his mind. He worried that even if he tried his hardest, everything might crumble again. But Buddy's steady presence reminded him of the small victories he had already made. The dog's calm, watchful posture reminded Daniel that he was not alone and that he had reasons to keep fighting. One evening, after a particularly long day of work at the harbor, Daniel received a thick envelope with his name printed neatly on the front. His hands trembled slightly as he held it. Buddy pressed close, sensing the tension rising in Daniel's body. They went inside the motorhome, and Daniel sat down at the table, slowly opening the envelope. He read each word carefully, then read them again to be certain. His breath caught in his throat as the meaning settled in. His application had been approved. The veteran assistance he had requested was granted. The letter included information about the financial support he would receive enough to repair the motorhome and reduce the weight of some lingering debt that had haunted him for years. Daniel felt a rush of emotion building inside him. Relief washed through him like a warm wave. His hands shook as he lowered the letter and pressed his forehead into his palms. Buddy moved beside him, placing his head on Daniel's knee in quiet acknowledgement. Daniel's voice trembled when he whispered, "We did it, Buddy." His eyes burned, but he held his breathing steady. For the first time in a long time, he felt the real possibility of a future that did not revolve around survival alone. He had a chance to rebuild, to fix the motorhome, to stand firmer on his feet. And though the road ahead was still long, Daniel knew he would not have reached this moment without Buddy's presence guiding him through every moment of doubt. That night, Daniel sat by the window with Buddy leaning against him. Outside, the lights of the harbor shimmered across the water, and the sky above them began to clear. The future felt uncertain, but for once, uncertainty did not terrify him. It simply felt open, possible. Buddy rested peacefully, and Daniel placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe he was moving towards something better, and that belief was strong enough to keep him steady. A soft morning light broke through a thin layer of clouds and cast a pale glow across the harbor. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of sea salt and warm metal from the docks. The motorhome stood quietly at the edge of the lot, no longer just a worn shelter, but a project waiting to be transformed. Daniel stood outside the motorhome, with sleeves rolled up and hands already marked with dust and grease from early morning work. His face looked tired, but steadier than in the past. There was a quiet determination in his eyes, a steadiness that had been missing for years. Buddy sat near the open door of the motorhome, stretching his legs before settling into a watchful posture. His golden and black fur glowed faintly in the muted sunlight, and his ears rose each time a tool made a new sound. Daniel had hired a mechanic named Frank to handle the repairs he could not do himself. Frank was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with thick arms, and a chest shaped by decades of lifting engines. His beard was gray and short, and his eyebrows always seemed slightly furrowed, giving him a constant expression of focus. He worked with little talk, but his movements were quick and precise. Daniel respected that about him. Frank checked the motor once more, before lowering himself under the vehicle again. Frank called out from beneath the chassis, "Engine needs new belts and the lines need flushing. Nothing we cannot handle." His voice was rough but steady. Daniel nodded and held the tools Frank asked for, keeping his body ready to help however possible. He felt an odd sense of pride assisting in the repair, even in small ways. Next came the tires. The old ones had been worn thin by years of neglect. Frank changed each one with practiced strength. The motorhome rose and fell gently as the work went on. Buddy watched the entire process without moving much, his head turning each time Frank shifted. He seemed to take his role very seriously, as if he were the supervisor of every step. When the mechanical work was finished, Daniel shifted toward another list of tasks. The electrical system needed fixing. He had hired a local electrician named Howard, a lean man in his early 60s with soft white hair and clear blue eyes. Howard had a quiet, gentle way of speaking, and he carried himself with the calmness of someone who had spent years solving complicated problems. He traced the wiring through the walls of the motorhome, shaking his head at the tangled mess before carefully replacing worn wires and fixing overhead lights. A plumber named Luis came later in the afternoon. Luis was a man with a stocky build, a warm smile and strong hands shaped by years of fitting pipes together. His dark hair showed streaks of silver on the sides, and his tone was friendly. He checked the pipes under the sink, replaced cracked tubes, and fixed the small water tank near the back of the motorhome. His laughter filled the small space and helped keep Daniel's spirits steady. Once the technical repairs were done, Daniel focused on the part he knew best. He began rebuilding the interior with his own hands. He bought wooden boards from a discount supply store and carried them to the motorhome piece by piece. He measured each panel with careful precision and cut the boards using a small saw he had borrowed. The sound of the saw filled the motorhome with a sharp rhythm, but for Daniel, it was comforting. It reminded him of a time in his life when he understood how to build something from nothing. Buddy remained stationed near the door every single day. Sometimes he sat upright. Sometimes he lay down with his head resting on his paws, but his position never changed. He seemed to believe it was his duty to guard the entrance and watch over Daniel as he worked. Whenever Daniel paused, Buddy would lift his head as if checking that everything was still fine. It brought Daniel a quiet sense of comfort he had not known for years. Little by little, the motorhome began to change. Daniel rebuilt the wooden cabinets in the small kitchen area, sanding them until the surface became smooth under his fingertips. He installed a new set of shelves near the bed and refitted the small table where he once struggled over paperwork. He laid new flooring with careful attention, pressing each section into place until the motorhome felt warmer and cleaner. Emily and Michael visited from time to time. Their presence was gentle and without pressure. Emily helped by sanding corners and painting window frames. She wore her hair tied back, and her movements were neat and careful. Even though she did not say much, there was a softness in the way she handed Daniel a brush or wiped dust from the counter. It was a quiet sign of support she had not shown in years. Michael helped with heavier tasks. He carried planks, lifted boxes, and assisted with painting the outer walls of the motorhome. His tall frame moved awkwardly at times, but he worked with surprising dedication. Each time Daniel thanked him, Michael would just shrug in that unsure teenage way, but there was pride in his eyes that he could not quite hide. Father and son worked near each other in silence, yet something delicate was rebuilding between them with every stroke of the brush. Days passed, and the motorhome slowly transformed. The new cabinets gave the small kitchen a warm glow. The fixed lights made the ceiling bright instead of gloomy. The fresh wooden floor removed the cold, damp feeling Daniel had lived with for so long. The small bed area became tidy and comfortable. Everything inside began to feel like a home rather than a shelter pieced together out of necessity. One evening, Daniel stepped back to look at the motorhome from a distance. The exterior now carried a smooth coat of clean paint. The tires were new, the engine solid, and the windows gleamed faintly in the fading light. Inside, the air smelled of fresh wood and faint paint instead of mold. Buddy stood next to him, tail lifting slowly, as if proud of the work Daniel had done. For a moment, Daniel felt something rise in his chest, a mixture of relief and gratitude that almost overwhelmed him. He placed his hand on Buddy's head and closed his eyes, letting the sensation settle. His life was far from perfect, and his struggles were not over, but the motorhome standing before him was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a place shaped by effort, by hope, and by the small gestures of a family learning to reconnect. Buddy pressed against his side, and Daniel smiled quietly. The old broken motorhome had turned into a warm mobile home filled with pieces of their shared work. Each repaired board and each brush of paint carried a memory of healing. And Daniel felt for the first time in many years that he was building something worth keeping. A mild morning light spread across the harbor as a soft golden haze drifted over the calm water. The sky was open and pale, touched by a gentle warmth that hinted at the approach of a peaceful day. The motorhome stood near the edge of the docks, no longer worn or sinking, but bright and clean, its fresh paint catching the early sun. Inside, Daniel ran a careful hand along one of the smooth wooden cabinets he had built himself. The scent of polished wood mixed with the faint smell of sea air drifting through the open door. It felt unreal at times to see how far things had come. The motorhome, which had once been a broken shell, was now a warm and living space filled with the marks of patient work and the steady presence of family. Buddy sat proudly near the entrance, his golden and black fur shining softly in the light. His posture was calm but alert, as if he understood that the motorhome now belonged not only to Daniel, but to the many people who would visit it. His steady eyes followed Daniel as he moved around preparing for the day. Daniel had spent months repairing the motorhome, and now it finally felt complete. Not perfect, but whole. He had added new flooring, a small kitchenette, smooth wooden storage compartments, and sturdy benches designed with the same careful touch he once put into carpentry years ago. His hands were still rough and scarred from work, but now they carried a quiet confidence. The new engine responded smoothly when turned on, and the tires were strong and clean. The wiring no longer hummed with danger, but instead provided safe, steady light to the interior. It was a place Daniel could be proud of, and every detail carried the memory of the long, hard path that led him here. With the motorhome complete, Daniel started a small service offering short coastal tours and minor repairs for people around the harbor. The idea was simple and honest. Visitors could sit inside the warm, wood-lined space while Daniel drove them along the coastline, sharing small bits of his knowledge of the area, while Buddy sat near their feet enjoying the attention. Residents from the town brought him small electrical problems, broken hinges or loose boards, and Daniel would fix them with the skill he thought he had lost. Buddy became the heart of everything. People remembered the motorhome because of him. Children hugged him. Older visitors patted his head and smiled warmly. Some people stopped by just to give Buddy a treat or sit beside him for a moment. He carried himself with gentle dignity, never demanding attention, but always offering his calm presence. He made everyone feel safe and welcome. Daniel watched how people reacted to Buddy and felt grateful each time. Without Buddy, he would never have found the hidden documents that guided him to veteran support. Without Buddy, he might have given up when paperwork overwhelmed him. Without Buddy, he might still be sleeping in the old truck, afraid to hope again. As the days passed, Daniel's family slowly became part of the motorhome too. His son Michael visited more often, sometimes helping replace small parts or riding along during a short tour. Michael had grown more relaxed around Daniel. He spoke more openly and smiled more often, especially when Buddy nudged him with friendly insistence. Emily, the ex-wife Daniel had once lost, drifted back into their lives in small, gentle steps. She often brought food to the harbor, simple meals warm and carefully prepared, as if she were trying to give Daniel something steady he could rely on. She did not make promises, and neither did he. But there was a quiet ease between them now. Time had softened the edges of their past, and the motorhome had become a space where they could talk without raising their voices. Daniel saw these changes and felt a cautious warmth grow inside him. It was fragile at first, but as weeks turned into months, he realized the warmth was not fading. It was becoming part of him. One afternoon, after finishing a short coastal tour, Daniel parked the motorhome at its usual place. Buddy jumped down, first his paws, landing softly on the wooden deck. Daniel followed, looking out at the calm water, stretching into the distance. The horizon seemed open, like a wide road inviting him forward. He stepped back into the motorhome and leaned against the counter, feeling the smooth surface under his hand. He remembered the darkest nights when rain leaked through the roof and the cold pressed against him. He remembered the moment Buddy pawed at the old rug, revealing the hidden compartment. He remembered the day the assistance letter arrived and the long, steady journey of rebuilding everything, piece by piece. And now, standing in a bright, finished home that rolled on wheels, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. He felt certain. He had a place. He had a purpose. He had a family that was slowly mending. And he had Buddy, the one constant that had never abandoned him, no matter how far he fell. As the sun lowered and cast warm gold across the water, Daniel stepped into the driver's seat. Buddy took his place at his side as he always did. Outside, Emily waited near the dock, holding a small bag of food for later. Michael leaned against the railing, watching the motorhome with a mixture of pride and excitement. They waved, and Daniel waved back with an easy smile. He started the engine. The motorhome hummed with a strong, steady sound. Buddy lifted his head, ears perked, eyes bright with gentle energy. Daniel looked ahead at the open road and felt no fear. The path was uncertain, but for once uncertainty felt like possibility. The motorhome rolled forward, leaving behind the old memories that once trapped him. Ahead of him was a new horizon, a quiet promise of a better future. Buddy glanced up at him, as if asking where they would go next. "Anywhere we want," Daniel whispered softly in the warm cabin. And he meant it. Together, Daniel and Buddy moved toward a new life, guided by the soft golden light of the setting sun, the warmth of their rebuilt family, and the steady hope that had finally found its way back into Daniel's heart. In the end, Daniel's journey became more than a story about hardship and survival. It became a quiet reminder that even the most worn-down life can be renewed with patience, kindness, and perseverance. The old motorhome that once felt like a burden became a home built with love, steady effort, and helping hands. Daniel discovered that healing does not happen in a rush. It happens in small steps, in shared moments, and in the simple acts of choosing hope again and again. Buddy, with his loyal heart, reminded everyone who met him that love can guide us even when our path feels unclear. The community around Daniel showed that compassion is never wasted, and family, whether broken or scattered, can find its way back to warmth. Daniel's new beginning was not born from luck, but from the gentle miracles that appear when people refuse to give up on themselves or each other. And as you listen to this story, I hope you feel a reminder of the quiet ways God still moves in ordinary days. Sometimes his miracles come as strength to stand up again, or as a loyal friend who sits beside you when the world feels heavy. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. May God bless you with peace, hope, and the courage to keep walking toward the light that waits ahead.